All right, buckle up, because today we're taking a deep dive into a case that spans continents and decades.
Whoa, this is going to be good.
We're uncovering the story of John Arthur Getreu.
An American serial killer.
Exactly. A serial killer whose crimes left investigators puzzled for years.
I've heard of this one. Sounds familiar.
Oh, yeah, you're going to find this one really unsettling. We've got excerpts from a Wikipedia article about him. And let me tell you, his ability to live a double life is, it's truly disturbing.
It's wild, right? How someone can commit such awful acts, but at the same time maintain a seemingly normal facade. Like, how do you do that?
Well, that's what we're going to try to find out.
Getreu's case, it really shows how complicated people are. Human nature can be really messed up sometimes.
No kidding. He was born in 1944, and his early life, well, it was marked by all these constant moves because of his father's military career. Think about that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, you're always the new kid, always having to adapt to new places, new people. Yeah.
Exactly. Forming bonds, breaking bonds, and never really having that stable base. It's got to have a huge psychological impact, don't you think?
Totally. I can't even imagine the challenges of growing up like that. Definitely something we should consider when we try to understand, the path that Getreu's life took.
Well, in 1960, the family ended up in West Germany, and this is where it gets really dark. Getreu commits his first murder at just 18 years old.
18, wow.
18. He met 15-year-old Margaret Williams at a school dance. And what happened after, well, the details are really horrific.
This one was particularly brutal.
It was.
He took her to the school's baseball field and assaulted her, raped her, and beat her so bad she died from a head injury. It's just the level of violence here is so disturbing. And at such a young age, it just suggests this total lack of regard for human life.
It's tough to even grasp such cruelty.
Yeah.
But thankfully, there were witnesses who had seen them together. So that led to his arrest.
Okay, good.
He was sentenced to 10 years.
10 years.
But get this, he only served 6 before being paroled and sent back to the U.S.
Wait, what? Seriously?
Seriously.
That just makes you wonder if maybe the justice system back then, maybe they just didn't recognize how dangerous he really was. I mean, 6 years.
It really raises some questions about, the whole idea of rehabilitation in these kinds of cases. I mean, was 6 years enough to address the issues that led him to do something so violent? I mean, we know the answer now, right?
Yeah, sadly we do.
And this is where that double life that we were talking about before, this is where it really starts. Getreu settles in California, and get this, he builds what looks like a completely normal life. Marriage, kids, involvement in the community, the whole 9 yards.
It's chilling, really, the fact that he could just blend right back into society.
Yeah.
Masking this dark, dark past, acting like nothing ever happened.
But that darkness, it resurfaces in the 1970s with 2 more murders in California. In 1973, 21-year-old Leslie Marie Perloff, she was a Stanford graduate, she disappears. Later, her body is found. She'd been strangled and left near a hiking trail.
And then, just a year later, in 1974, the body of another young woman is discovered. This time, it's 21-year-old Janet Ann Taylor, a college student. Also found near a hiking trail, also strangled, and they determined that she was sexually assaulted.
These cases, the similarities between them are just, well, they're hard to ignore.
Absolutely.
2 young women, both in their early 20s, found near hiking trails, both strangled. It's like a pattern is emerging here. You know what we call that in the biz?
A modus operandi.
Bingo. Like a criminal signature. The specific way they carry out their crimes. In Getreu's case, it seems like he was targeting young women, maybe finding some twisted sense of control, of power in these awful acts.
That's really disturbing.
And for decades, these cases, they went unsolved. The families of these victims, you can imagine the pain they must have felt. No answers, no closure.
It's heartbreaking, honestly, to think about them carrying that weight of unresolved trauma for years and years, just hoping that someday, somehow, justice would be served. And then, in 2018, finally, a major breakthrough happens. And I think you're going to find this one really remarkable.
Oh, I'm on the edge of my seat here. Tell me more. What happened in 2018?
It all comes down to this new cutting-edge science. You ready for this?
Lay it on me.
Genetic genealogy.
Genetic genealogy. Now that sounds high-tech. I like it.
Oh, it is.
Okay, so genetic genealogy, it sounds like something straight out of CSI. How did it help solve this case?
Oh, it's pretty wild. Investigators used DNA samples from those crime scenes, and they ran them through these public genealogy databases. You know, the ones where people find out about their ancestry.
Yeah, I've seen those ads.
So it's like building a family tree, but in reverse, using DNA to connect the dots.
Wow, so they actually tracked him down using his family's DNA.
Yep, they did, and it led straight to his arrest in 2018.
After all those years. That's incredible. I mean, it makes you wonder how many other cold cases could be solved using this technology.
A lot, probably. It's a game changer for sure, especially for those families who have been waiting for justice for, well, forever, like Leslie Perlov's and Janet Taylor's families.
It must have been such a relief for them. Finally, some answers after all that time.
Oh, yeah, it definitely offered closure. But there's more to the story. I mean, it's not all neatly tied up in a bow.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, there are still some unanswered questions, some mysteries about Getreu that make you wonder just how much he really got away with.
Okay, now I'm even more intrigued. What else is there?
Let's back up a little. Go back to 1969. A few years after he got back to the U.S., there was a woman named Sharon Luchese.
Sharon Luchese, okay.
And she came forward with a pretty disturbing accusation.
What kind of accusation?
She claimed that Getreu tried to kill her, back when they both lived in Reno, Nevada.
Hold on, so this is before the California murders.
Yeah, years before.
So it's like, this wasn't just some isolated thing. Like, his violence, it could have been going on for a lot longer.
That's what it looks like. And think about this. Luchese didn't come forward until 2019, after Getreu was already arrested for those other murders.
Imagine holding on to that for all those years. That's heavy stuff.
Definitely. And it makes you think, right? How many other victims might be out there? People who never reported what happened or who are still dealing with the trauma of what he did.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
And there's more. There's a possible connection to yet another murder.
Wait, another one.
A 15-year-old girl named Teresa Smith back in 1980 in Newark, Ohio.
Newark, Ohio. Okay.
Now, Getreu lived in Newark around that time, late 1970s, early 80s, so geographically it lines up.
So he could have been involved. But is there any actual evidence linking him to this Teresa Smith case?
Nothing concrete yet. No charges have been filed. It's still an open investigation.
So even after his death, they're still trying to figure out how many crimes he was actually responsible for.
Yeah, it's like this never-ending puzzle. You know, a journalist named Grace Kong and a team of investigators looked into this possible connection back in 2022. They think there's enough there to keep digging.
Wow, this is crazy. It makes you realize we might never have the full picture. All the things he did, the people he hurt, it's unsettling, to say the least.
It is, and it really shows the challenges of dealing with cold cases. Time can make things so difficult, but there is one thing that has changed a lot in recent years.
You mean like technology?
Exactly, forensic technology, like that genetic genealogy we were talking about before. It's really revolutionizing how we look at these old cases.
Yeah, that is pretty mind-blowing. It's like almost giving those cases new life. But how does it even work?
Well, basically, they take a DNA sample from a crime scene.
Right.
And then they compare it to all the DNA profiles in these public genealogy databases. And by finding matches, even with distant relatives, they can piece together a whole family tree. And eventually, they can narrow it down to a suspect.
So it's like using DNA as a roadmap to track down criminals.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But doesn't that bring up some privacy issues? Like, what about people's rights?
Absolutely. That's the big question. I mean, using genetic genealogy in law enforcement, it's a double-edged sword. You have the potential to solve these terrible crimes, right? Bring justice to the victims and their families.
Right.
But then there's that other side, the concerns about privacy, about this information being misused.
It's a tough one.
It is. And it's only going to get more complicated as technology keeps advancing. We need to figure out, as a society, how to balance public safety with individual rights.
You're right. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
Well, we've really gone deep into this whole John Getreu story today. The murders, the mystery, the technology that finally brought him down. It's a lot to take in.
It is. And even though he's dead, even though he was convicted, the investigation is still ongoing. It's like there's this sense of resolution, but also this feeling of unease, like we're not done yet.
Yeah, I get that. Well, before we wrap up our deep dive, there's one more thing I want to touch on with you. It's something I keep coming back to. We've been talking about this guy, John Getreu, and how he lived this, like, totally normal life on the surface, but had this incredibly dark side. But the thing that keeps bugging me is, how the heck did he manage to get away with it for so long? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's a question we ask in a lot of these cases. It feels like someone doing these horrible things, you'd think they'd mess up, right? Leave some kind of trail. But in Getreu's case, there are a few things that probably helped him stay under the radar for so many years.
Okay, so what are we talking about? What helped him?
Well, remember how we were discussing his double life? Like, this guy was a master at deception.
Oh, yeah, he was good.
He had a family, he held down jobs, he was involved in his community. I mean, that kind of outward appearance of, being a normal, respectable person, it can make it really, really hard for people to even think about him being capable of these crimes.
That's like that saying, right? A wolf in sheep's clothing.
Exactly. And then you got to remember, this guy moved around a lot. That kind of transient lifestyle makes it way harder for investigators to connect the dots.
Right, like by the time they're starting to get close, he's already packed up and moved on to someplace new.
It's like a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse keeps changing the rules. Plus, think about the technology back
Yeah,
then.
good point.
We didn't have all the fancy forensic tools we have today. I mean, DNA analysis was in its infancy, and things like genetic genealogy, forget about it.
So they were stuck with eyewitness accounts, which, let's face it, aren't always the most reliable, and whatever physical evidence they could find, which was much harder to analyze without today's tech.
Exactly. So he was basically taking advantage of those gaps in the system, moving around, exploiting the limited technology of the time to stay ahead of the game. Scary to think about.
It is scary. But at least those advancements in forensics, especially things like genetic genealogy, they're making it a lot harder for these guys to hide.
That's the silver lining for sure. But yeah, it doesn't take away the harm he caused. It's important to remember that. So as we wrap this up, what do you think is the big takeaway from all this?
I think, for me, it's a reminder that even when we're faced with something truly evil, we can't give up on seeking truth and justice. This Getreu case, it shows how dedicated investigators can be, how far science has come, and most importantly, how there's always hope, even for these super complex mysteries, that someday they'll be solved. I mean, it might take a while, but eventually the truth comes out.
You said it. And it's also a reminder that sometimes evil hides in plain sight, behind these everyday normal facades. So to our listeners out there, as you go about your day, keep what we talked about today in mind. Think about John Getreu. Not to glorify what he did, but to stay vigilant, because you never know what's lurking beneath the surface.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us. Stay curious, everyone, and until next time, take care.